Welcome to A Christian Response with me, Dave Piper, on TWR-UK. In this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. We're finding out what motivates people to stand up for those in poverty, to tackle human trafficking, and to champion those in the latter years of their lives, amongst many other issues. We're speaking to church leaders, charity staff, experts and volunteers to get a grasp of the numerous problems in our communities that can be fixed by prayer, practical action and political intervention. We're taking lessons from Scripture about how we as followers of Christ should respond to those around us. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on anything you hear this week on the programme, then please do feel free to email us. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. We're joined this week by the Christian lawyer Andrew Caplen, and we're talking today, Andrew, on the series about justice, and specifically with your experience as a lawyer, justice in our courts and in that part of our justice system. I wonder if we can start this whole discussion by looking at what you think we actually mean in UK society when we do talk about justice.
I think that everybody knows what justice is if they really think about it. But sometimes we can go to the extremes. So some people might think that justice is when somebody gets their just desserts, and it's all about sentencing and things like that. When actually justice, of course, when we start to think about it, is much wider than that, because the courts don't just cover the criminal system, they cover the civil system as well. So it can be a neighbour dispute, it can be a property dispute, it can be many things. It can be obtaining access to somebody's children or something like that. So I would say that justice really means putting things right, making them fair. So it's a big word, it covers an awful lot, but I think that probably the easiest definition is to say it's making things right, it's being fair with things.
And it's interesting that you use the word fair, because for a lot of our time we hear words like equal, we hear things around everything having exactly the same opportunity or the same access to things. But fairness is a bit more complicated, isn't it, than just saying, well, everyone gets, for instance, this amount towards legal aid, or everyone gets this sentence for doing exactly the same crime irrespective of their circumstances, etc.
Well, absolutely. I think you're right to pick up on the word fairness, because sometimes you can go down equality and it's not quite the same thing. I mean, fairness is that everybody has a fair hearing, that everybody has the same access to the courts, that judges are not biased, that everybody can present their case properly, that full disclosure is given to people. I mean, to example of fair disclosure was the post office case, in that there wasn't fairness there, because even though it appears that the post office knew there were problems with the Horizon system, there wasn't disclosure to the defence lawyers or to the defendants, which enabled them to put together a proper defence. You know, they knew that there was a problem with the system, they didn't disclose it, and then you ended up with a system where people were convicted and made bankrupt, and that definitely is not fair.
Have you found that in your own career, that there's a bit of a problem there, particularly around disclosure? Maybe tell us a bit more about what your career consists of as well, because it must be frustrating as a lawyer when you maybe suspect that there's things not being done in the fair way, and there's not really all that much you can do about it.
I mean, what I would say is I think that our system in the UK is pretty good, and that's why there's a sadness over the post office matter, because that's something which is not UK, it's not English, it's not the way that we operate. I mean, my legal career is, I was a solicitor for many years, I was a partner in a firm in Southampton, and I dealt with a range of matters. I mean, I had my time in the criminal courts, I did a lot of advocacy in various courts, and then I went to something called the Law Society of England and Wales, where I ended up as president there. And that was looking at questions of justice from a much wider perspective, a whole perspective, if you like, a governmental perspective as well. Disclosure, though, has changed, and generally the requirements for disclosure are much stricter than they were when I started in practice. The prosecution service are supposed to disclose fully anything which might prejudice their case as well as help their case.
And of course, when we look at things like that, the compensation that's now being paid to some of those sub-postmasters, the huge cost in legal fees as well, it is very costly when justice goes wrong, isn't it? And I just wonder if that also leads on to the concept of whether cost is a barrier, something that prevents us getting justice sometimes in the first place.
There's an old saying that the Ritz Hotel is open to all, and justice is a bit like that. Theoretically it's open to all, but cost actually can be a driving factor, in that if you've got a state or you've got an organisation who has unlimited funds, they're actually in a much stronger position to fight legal cases than somebody who has very limited funds, because court proceedings are expensive. And so if you have an imbalance on assets between one party and the other, then it could mean that the smaller party would either settle unfavourably or would actually have to drop the claim just because they cannot compete with the resources that the more stronger party has. I mean, that's unfortunate. It's always been the case. And in the UK, once again, is generally we've got a lot better of that until perhaps recent years with the legal aid cuts. But the post office, again, is another example where you had an authority which had almost unlimited resources, and then you had poor individuals who did not have very much resources and could not fight cases when actually they were on the verge of bankruptcy anyway.
You're listening to A Christian Response on TWR-UK with me, Dave Piper. Over the course of this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. We're finding out what motivates Christians to pray and act, and what the Bible teaches us about our duties and responsibilities to those around us. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're covering, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. You mentioned, Andrew, your work with the Law Society, president of that body, looking at access in the round, as it were, access to justice. Do you think that there are other major issues that do actually potentially prevent or anyway delay justice being done?
I mean, there's two big issues at present. Well, three, I would say, is one is the funding thing, is that legal aid has been cut and cut and cut. There have been some slight increases under this present government, but most of the time legal aid has been stored for about 30 odd years. And that doesn't mean that there haven't been even inflationary increases to the lawyers fighting the case. So that's, lack of funding is a problem. Then there's a question of delay as well. It's quite noticeable in the news that some of the cases coming to trial are not going to be heard to 2027, 2028 or beyond. And that's not good for justice, because it means that parties are in limbo for many years. It means that witnesses might die or might go away. It means that defendants actually might, be prejudiced. They might be locked up on remand. Or it could be that those people who are claiming or those people who are victims have a long time before they actually can have their evidence heard. And that's not helpful to them either. They can't move on. I mean, I think the third thing that concerns me is the disparity between a lawyer's wage who's dealing with access to justice matters in the criminal courts or the civil courts under legal aid, and lawyers who are earning a lot in the city. That's not to criticise city lawyers, but if city lawyers are earning X plus 10 whatever, and the legal aid solicitors working and receiving X, then you can understand that lawyers who can, unless they have a real heart for this type of work, are going to actually go as far as they can because they've got mortgages to pay. And so I guess there's three things. One is this, the lack of funding in the system. The second is the delay in the system. And the third is we want the best lawyers dealing with these cases, and we don't perhaps always get that. That's not to disparage those people who are involved in it, but that's just common sense, really.
You spoke about people having a heart for defending people in criminal courts, going down that legal aid route and providing expertise for those people who need it the most, some would argue. Do you think God has a heart for justice as well?
I think absolutely. I think that justice is one of the primary themes in the Bible. I mean, probably the second primary theme after the salvation message. And one could say that there's a measure of justice actually within the salvation system too. I mean, there's a lot in the Bible about justice and about speaking up for those people who can't speak for themselves. I think Proverbs actually says that, that's what we should do. And actually to speak up, whether it's as a legal advocate or whether it's helping somebody with a benefits claim or whether it's providing support to somebody who's subject to gender-based violence, perhaps, these are all things that actually the Bible says that we should be doing. We should speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. I mean, I like to think that law is a very Christian profession if it's dealt right.
And of course, when we talk about speaking up, we can often read the Bible and think this is applying to me. This is God speaking to me. But is it also speaking to people in positions of power, rulers, leaders, those elected to high office, as well as ordinary Christians in the pews?
Well, absolutely. There's a passage in Deuteronomy which talks about when a king is appointed. We know that from our reading of the Old Testament that it wasn't always God's primary plan to have a king, but he accepted the fact that there would be a king one day. And in Deuteronomy, he says that a king should not lord it over others. He should not accumulate lots of gold and lots of horses, and that he should also be as subject to the laws that is the people actually who he reigns over. And I think that's very, very important. This is a whole question of the rule of law, is that actually it doesn't matter whether we're an individual, a homemaker, a lawyer, a carpenter, whatever we might do, or a president or a king, we're still subject to the law. And the rule of law is a very, very important topic, a very, very important thing that we should be complied with.
We often read and hear and watch things, maybe we even think these things ourselves, that actually either on the one hand our system of justice is so broken, has gone so far from the rule of law that we might as well give up, or we look at it and say, well, who gave them the right to pass those laws? Those laws aren't good for me. I don't like those laws. Do you think all of this, as Christians, ties back into the concept of ultimately where the authority that our authorities have actually comes from?
I wouldn't say that the UK system of justice is beyond repair. I think it's struggling, and I think it has the challenges that we've actually already spoken about. I do think, however, that we are blessed with fair judges. It's very unusual for a judge to be seen to be biased. We don't think for one moment that our judges take bribes, and I think that's very important. And so I'd say that it's not broken from that point of view. It doesn't matter who we vote as politicians, we're still going to have independent judges. And I hope that that never changes. I hope that the appointment of judges always stays completely independent.
You're listening to A Christian Response on TWR-UK with me, Dave Piper. Over the course of this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. We're finding out what motivates Christians to pray and act, and what the Bible teaches us about our duties and responsibilities to those around us. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're covering, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. when we look at justice, and particularly justice in the courts, it's very easy, isn't it, to see the headlines of this person has been sent away for this many years for this atrocious crime. Is there a sense that we tend to focus on just one reason for justice, and that is punishment of offenders, rather than actually realising all the other reasons there are for justice to be done?
It comes back to how we define the word justice. I was interested in the ramifications of what was said after the Charlie Kirk shooting in the US, in that Charlie Kirk's widow had one attitude to Mr. Trump, who was all in favor of capital punishment. And that was a different form of justice. It was about judgment. It was about retribution. It was almost about revenge. And I think that's difficult. I think that justice, as I said, is much, much wider than all of this. It is about fairness. And there are many reasons why people should go to prison. One of them is to protect the public. One is punishment. One is a warning for other people that they don't have that sort of behavior. However, fairness is really important in the civil system. And that's why the cases that come before there, because justice is not just about the criminal courts, it's about civil courts as well.
And we do sometimes see, and I wonder if this explains that to some extent, we do sometimes see instances where someone has sued somebody else for libel, for defamation, for whatever reason, and they're found in their favour, but they're given just a token award of compensation. Is that part of that?
I think that most lawyers who are doing their job properly would advise their clients very carefully before they undertake actions like that. You know, if, for example, a neighbour dispute, do you really want to go to court on a neighbour dispute because of the costs that will be incurred, the upset that will be incurred, and it might make your property difficult to sell? I think that when you go to courts asking for what you might call justice, you might need to take a step back and look at it a bit more in the round. There are things which are important to go to court. You know, things like non-molestation orders where somebody's been evicted, to deal with custody of children, to deal with care orders and many things like that. I'm also reminded that Jesus told the story about if somebody wants you to go a mile, then go 2 miles, and Paul warns about lawsuits between believers. Now, against that, you've got the fact that we are called to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. I think that what the New Testament is saying is not contradicting what the Old Testament said, but basically saying is think very carefully as to whether it actually does credit to your Christian convictions. But also there's the advice that, be careful when you go to court, when you go to law.
And I wonder if that can help us even understand a bit more closely the gospel message, the message of salvation itself, because you mentioned at the start that there might even be an element of justice involved in that. And we hear about scandalous grace, don't we? This idea that God actually took our punishments through his son on our behalf. And that doesn't seem objectively to be justice in some senses.
I think a slight story that might help, it to explain this, is that very often as a lawyer, particularly as a Christian lawyer, strangely, is people will ask me, how can you represent someone who you know is guilty? It's a very common question that people ask criminal lawyers, a very common question that people have asked me in churches over the years. Of course, the answer is all about legal ethics, and you can't be party to a lie, but you are called to represent the client to the best of your ability. However, there's a Christian answer to that. How can you represent someone you know is guilty? Isn't that what Jesus did for us on the cross? He represented us, knowing that we were guilty, so that our relationship with God could be restored. I think it's a wonderful turnaround of a question, actually, in that, yes, it needs the thought about what legal ethics are and what the role of the lawyer is too. But there's also that salvation element of it. Is it exactly what Jesus did for us on the cross? We're all guilty. None of us are innocent. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But through Jesus, we actually have the hope of now and a hope of a secure future in eternity too.
And when we come back to human justice from that perspective, does that explain why many would argue justice is not just about punishment, it's not even just about protecting people on our streets, but it's also has elements of mercy, elements of forgiveness woven into it?
It does have an element of restoration as well. I mean, restoration is a good word, and that's actually the what Jesus did on the cross. Restoration of our relationship with God. I mean, mercy is really important too. You know, to that passage from Micah about going for mercy, loving justice, and walking humbly with our God. I think that sometimes it can be a danger that we want the justice. We're not dreadfully sure what the mercy is, but actually that bit about walking humbly with our God is really important too. Because walking humbly with our God means that we understand that we are no better other than for the grace of God than anybody else is either. And so therefore, thinking on that, that should actually say we need to actually change our thoughts as far as justice is concerned and perhaps concentrate upon the mercy. Now, once again, there's limits to this as well, because there are times within the criminal courts, for example, that somebody's offence is so heinous that they should have a whole life order, to be frank. And then there's a question about you need to send that warning to others and you need to make sure that people are protected. So there is a limit on the mercy from a practical point of view, but that doesn't mean to say that our attitude is any different. And walking humbly with our God, understanding what mercy is, then we'll really understand justice.
You're listening to A Christian Response on TWR-UK with me, Dave Piper. Over the course of this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. We're finding out what motivates Christians to pray and act, and what the Bible teaches us about our duties and responsibilities to those around us. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're covering, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. We do hear quite often in social media and in the headlines, don't we, people complaining about justice, saying, going back to the concept of fairness, that wasn't fair. They did the same crime, but they got let off with a much lighter sentence, or it's not right that they should get that lower punishment for what they've done, whether we're talking criminal or civil cases here. Do you think if we get our minds around the concepts of mercy, restoration and forgiveness, that can actually help us to see that there should, in certain circumstances, be different results to what look on the surface to be similar cases?
When you represent someone in the criminal courts, it's not that common for there to be a not guilty trial. Most people who come before the criminal courts, if the police have done their job properly, if the prosecution have done their job properly, and the people are actually guilty, will actually plead guilty. And so the exercise for a lawyer is one called mitigation. And mitigation means that you try and say something on behalf of the client which will mitigate the sentence. It could be that they haven't committed this sort of offence before, or they've never been convicted of anything. You know, it could be that it was an offence that happened at the spur of the moment rather than something that was pre-planned. And it could be that there might be personal circumstances, you know, in their upbringing, or things that they might be involved in which are completely out of character. What we don't necessarily understand or appreciate is that when you come to the courts, you might have people who have committed similar offences, but the mitigation might be different, in that there might be something within their background, something about the offence, which means that a judge should realistically take a lighter view when it comes to sentencing. There are something around called sentencing guidelines, and these are passed by a particular council that looks at these from time to time. And in these sentencing guidelines is what's known as a baseline sentence that should be imposed on a particular sort of offence, like, say, for example, reckless driving or grievous bodily harm. But then along with that, there's what they call mitigating factors and aggravating factors. And some mitigating factors will mean that the sentence will be reduced, and aggravating ones which will mean that they will actually be increased. So it can be quite a straight line thing if we're not careful here, in that if we don't understand what actually has been put before the court and the circumstances behind somebody's offending, then we can actually say whether there's equality in sentencing or not. What I would say is judges generally get it right. You know, there is the ability for the Attorney General to look at sentences again if she thinks that they are not adequate, they're not severe enough. It's very unusual for that sort of referral to be made to the courts.
Just finally then, Andrew, as we finish our discussion about justice in the courts and the Christian response to that, hopefully most, if not all of us, will never have to experience the courts, will never be in that serious a position where we need their intervention. Is it still important, you think, for Christians across the UK to be praying for our legal system, to be praying that justice would be done in our courts?
Absolutely. And this too is that when I was a junior lawyer and training to be a lawyer in the first 2 years after I qualified, you know, being a young Christian, being a lawyer is something I was very conscious of in the church that I was at, is they didn't pray for the lawyers. I think the lawyers were thought of being a bit, I don't know, but there was that element of praying for Christian professions, what people thought were Christian professions. So they were the church workers, they were the teachers, they were the caring professions. And actually, it would have been such a help for me when I was a young lawyer if I knew that somebody was praying for me, because some of the things that I saw from day to day were actually quite distressing and there was nowhere to go with. I like the work that LICC, London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, have been doing about saying, I think they do something called This Time Tomorrow. It's not just lawyers that need praying for from a day-to-day basis, but all of us, in whatever profession we are in, whatever situation, whatever occupation, whether a home worker or a lawyer or a teacher or a nurse or a doctor, whatever, we still need prayer from the Christian community. And I'd love to see a church whereby we pray for each other in whatever position we are, that we might not only be good at what we do and effective to what we do, but actually we might be witnesses to Jesus in what we do by the way that we do it, and when we have the opportunity by what we say.
Andrew Caplen, thank you for joining us today. And that's all we got time for on this week's episode of A Christian Response. I'm Dave Piper, and it's been a pleasure to have your company over the past half hour as we've taken a closer look at how Christians are responding and can respond to the major issues in life, whether that's in our own towns and cities, across the nations of the UK, or even reaching out into the wider world. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're discussing, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. And you can stream or download this week's episode now in full at the website. Just go to twr.org.uk/on-demand and search for A Christian Response.
This podcast is a production of Transworld Radio UK. For more information, go to our website at twr.org.uk.